Okay, so welcome to our lecture on the Declaration of Independence. Again, I will try to go through this relatively quickly, but with this, there is a bit more of a, the way that I do this is somewhat specific, maybe not exactly like you might find in other places, and this is going to have a lot to do with your short essay and other things like that, okay? So let's get into it here. The Declaration of Independence, primary author, Thomas Jefferson, okay? So this is in your course packet, American Government Readings in Blackboard. You can also find it in the appendix of your textbook. Obviously, it's widely available online as well. So let's start here and just read, and then I will go over some of this, okay? So we'll move back and forth between the text and the notes. Declaration of Independence, unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Okay, so in a very simple sense, what's going on here, basically there's a Declaration of Independence, a few things. First of all, important to remember that this is not the Constitution, okay? Totally different document from the US Constitution. The Declaration of Independence begins basically the War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, by saying that the 13 colonies plan to separate themselves from Great Britain, what we would now call the United Kingdom. It's not the Constitution, which comes 13 years later, whatever it is, 12 years, 11, whatever it is, comes later, okay? So the Declaration of Independence has no actual legal status in the United States today, okay? It's still the Declaration of Independence, but it is in no way the Constitution. It doesn't have any real legal status. It's not legally binding. So the fact that a statement or an idea may be in the Declaration of Independence doesn't mean that it is legally binding on the government or anything else like that. Now, that being said, it's an extremely important document in terms of articulating the principles, the ideals of American political life, okay? So what it's stating here in this first paragraph, a lot of these underlying ideas are extremely important and really shape American political life right up to today, and probably for as long as there will be an American political life, as long as there will be a community of the United States in which people share some of the same basic ideas and are bound together by those ideas. Okay, so the next paragraph is the most famous one, but this first one is important. Okay, basically what it's saying is that when you're going to declare your independence and basically say that it's time for you to assume an independent status in the world, to which people are entitled by nature and nature's God, which we'll talk about in a second. But when you are going to do those things, the first paragraph is saying, basically, as they put it, as Jefferson is the primary author here, a decent respect for the opinion of the rest of mankind basically says you should explain why. So basically, he's saying, but they all sign it, so they're all kind of speaking together, basically saying that when you know that you're about to start a revolution, when you're going to break away, as people are entitled to do for reasons that will be explained here in this, a little bit in this paragraph, and especially in the next, still, a decent respect for the opinions of the rest of the world mean that you should explain why you think this is necessary, okay? So a few things from this first paragraph, this phrase, to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another people. When he's saying, when you have to, he's talking about revolution. It's it's not quite as cutting to the point as you might expect. It's not, quite as blunt about what's actually going on, but he's basically saying revolution, okay? When you say we need to be separate from the British, and obviously they're not just going to accept that, so you're starting a war, right? But that's what it's saying, the political bands which have connected them with another people. So note the political bands here connect them with other people. And this is a really important idea in the Declaration of Independence. The real basis for legitimacy, what makes a government justified, is the people, not the government itself, not the tradition which the king or the government of whatever sort might claim for itself, but the people that the government is representing or should be representing well, okay? So it's already there, basically, so that's what that means if you're a little bit confused by that phrase. And again, some of the ideas are already there. What are the important political bands which need to be dissolved? Not the bands between the American people and the king, but the American people and the British people, who are right now connected by the same government. And they're going to say, we're going to overthrow this government. We're going to break from it. We feel like we need to declare independence and be separated from this government because it's not representing us in the way that it should. It's not doing what a government is supposed to do. And the rest of the document explains what that is and what that means, okay? Goes on and says, when they claim their right to the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, okay, people sometimes interpret this in a Christian or even a theist way, and it's not, okay? Jefferson himself was very famously, not quite an atheist, but certainly not a Christian or a theist. Most of the founders, some of them were Christians, most of them were subscribed to or adhered to a philosophy called deism. And the idea of deism is that if you look at the world, you see there's a rational order to it, which we as reasonable creatures, human beings, can grasp with our minds. So it makes sense to think that there was an intelligence that created it, right? Just like the famous image that deists used. If you found a watch on the beach somewhere, you pick it up, you notice that it keeps time, and there's obviously an orderly mechanism to it. You would assume that somebody built this watch, right? You wouldn't assume that somehow through some chance operation of the wind and the waves and everything, the sand has somehow produced this obviously orderly mechanism that was keeping time. But you would also notice that it's very regular. And deists did not really believe in any kind of supernatural in things like miracles or in Revelation. So, and again, this notion that the founders were Christian, that's not true. And I think sometimes people are just a little bit naive. Other times maybe they're a little weak-minded and they can't really accept that different things that they like might actually be at odds with each other. Sometimes there might be something a little bit darker going on. But one way or the other, it's just not true, okay? And this is not a Christian statement. The notion nature, okay? How do we know what these laws are? We study nature. We use reason to study nature. We don't rely on religious tradition. This is the entire point of this phrase, okay? Nature and nature's God, the God that you learn about from studying nature, okay? Nature, this is a very old idea, goes back to the ancient Greeks. The notion is nature is everywhere the same. You study biology, it's pretty much the same all over the world. The United States, China, France, Brazil, same human body, same set of physical laws, same set of biological truths. Laws, on the other hand, very different. Laws in France and the United States are different, and they're much different than they are in, say, China or Saudi Arabia. Laws change, but the notion here is nature is everywhere the same. Nature, if you want to understand what is universally true, and therefore in a sense really true, because one of the things that we usually mean by truth is it's universally true. If we say something is true, it's true everywhere and for everybody. If it changes, maybe that's not actually truth. So again, this is a very old idea going back, the notion that nature is real and it's deeper than convention. It's deeper than the societies that people have created, which are often unjust and, for lack of a better word, deformed, or often not very good. And that's basically what Jefferson is saying here. If you study nature and the laws of nature, and then a certain God that emerges from that, a certain conception of God that emerges from that, you will see that there is a set of truths about human beings and about society, okay? Which again, these are in many ways, I mean, there were all kinds of changes happening in institutional and quasi-institutional Christianity at the time, but a lot of what he's saying here is also pretty much at odds with traditional Christianity. The notion that we are all primarily individuals is a relatively modern and radical idea, okay? Which we'll get to in a second, okay? So basically what he says is this right to political equality that he's about to talk about is natural, it's universal, it's deeper, it's truer, it's more powerful than convention, than what we see in society, which again, if you go back to 1776 and you look around Europe, what do you see? You see kings and aristocracies. You don't see this kind of completely equal society that Jefferson is talking about and that they're all going to sign their names to, okay? We'll talk about the limitations to that in a second. But this notion that what is naturally true, what is rationally, what you can understand if you study nature rationally and seriously, if you use reason to understand what's going on, what you will see is that all people are equal. If you look at society, you'll see that's not what you see at all. You see kings and aristocracies, a lot of notions of inherited privilege and power and prerogative and hierarchy, right? People are born into different classes in society at this time. The notion is, if you look at nature though, not the societies that we've made for ourselves, but nature, what is really true, you'll see that people are actually equal. And all of these kind of hereditary permanent inequalities that we've built into our society are not natural, and they therefore really cannot be justified, okay? So let's go on here and read the switchback to the document itself. Read this next paragraph, the very famous one. So it goes on and says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Then he goes on and says, prudence basically says you're not going to do this at the drop of a hat. Okay, you're not going to, basically what he's saying here at the end is that there's a right to revolution, which is very radical and no pun intended, a literally revolutionary idea, both in the sense that obviously it's justifying revolution, but it's also very new and it's really kind of shocking to people. And it's no one had really quite thought of government that way before, that the people can just rise up and overthrow it whenever they feel like it's not doing what it's supposed to for them. But basically, and then he says, prudence says you're not going to do this over nothing. You're not going to do this over a minor inconvenience or some relatively minor thing that you disagree with, with a law or something that the government is doing. It's going to be something very serious and a sustained pattern of abuses, which is really what the rest of the document is about, is explaining the things that the king has done that they feel justify this fairly obviously radical and irrevocable and very dramatic and very dangerous act of rebellion, okay? So these ideas, nature's law, the rationalism, this kind of Enlightenment version of rationalism, right? This is the period of the Enlightenment, the view that the natural sciences and other things will give us truth, more truth than reliance on tradition, whether that's philosophic tradition, political tradition in the form of, again, monarchies and things like that that governed most of Europe at the time, or religious tradition, where again, you don't have to be radically anti-religious to be part of the Enlightenment, but it's certainly a lot of these fundamental Enlightenment ideas are very much at odds with a lot of traditional versions of religion, and at odds with the idea that religion should have that much political power, because again, it can't necessarily be recognized by everybody, which is a whole other story, okay? Basic point, okay, nature's God, rationalism. If we study nature, what we find is these truths are self-evident, okay? The famous phrase, again, they're self-evident, okay? The basic idea is human reason can grasp these things very quickly, very obviously. Again, self-evident. Who denies them? The people who benefit from the forms of inequality, the aristocrats, the people who want to have this enormous wealth, and it just comes to them through heredity. The monarchs, the people who benefit from this system of inequality are the ones who are denying what is self-evidently true, which is that by nature, all people are equal. Now, obviously, if you look, people are not actually completely equal. If you read some of the things from this time who are making these arguments that people are by nature equal, first of all, one of their arguments was a lot of the things that we think of as natural differences, even physical differences, but especially intellectual or moral differences, may actually have much more to do with socialization and the way people are raised and the ways that they're cultivated or nurtured in society. So part of their, if you say, well, obviously people aren't natural, some are stronger, some are faster, some are wiser, some are more courageous, some are more moderate, whatever you think virtue is. Some people are obviously more virtuous than others. One of the arguments was, yes, but that might be more a product of society than nature. So if we really could get at what was natural, you may see that a lot of these differences, even physical differences, have more to do with the way that people have been affected by society, especially early in life. The other argument, though, was, okay, so people are different. So some people are stronger, some people are faster, some people are wiser, smarter, some people are more courageous, some people have better self-control, whatever it is. Nobody is so unequal that they need to be governed by somebody else, okay? A 5-year-old really cannot govern themselves, right? A 5-year-old cannot really make the decisions that they need to do much of anything, to feed themselves, to understand all kinds of things, right? you would say a 5-year-old is clearly unequal compared to, say, a 40-year-old. Makes a lot of sense that a 25-year-old, hopefully. But, any number of things, right? When you're talking about adults and children, there's a clear, real, fundamental, important, and natural inequality where it makes sense that children would be governed by adults. But the argument that people made, when they're talking about this, and the notion that people are by nature equal, is that naturally there's no inequality that is so significant that it actually justifies the notion that one person should rule another. Nobody is so weak or so foolish or so improvident or so cowardly or immoderate or whatever that they actually need to be governed by somebody else, that they actually need to give up their natural freedom and let somebody else rule them, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about this idea of social contract theory when we talk a little bit further on. Probably not in this lecture, probably about the Constitution, okay? And the Anti-Federalists. But the basic idea is that, yes, there are natural differences. Even if we grant that, none of the natural differences are so important that you could justify one person actually ruling somebody else the way that, say, a king rules their subjects, right? Which at the time was oftentimes the view. There was the idea of the divine right of kings. There was also the notion that the king governed society as a father governing a family. That the king had a kind of, first of all, that there was this almost that society and nations were almost like families, and the king was like the father, and that there was this really almost kind of family, almost a biological connection between the members of the society, and especially the king, but also the notion that the people couldn't govern themselves. The king, for whatever combination of reasons, and there were different versions of the arguments for this, but for whatever combination of reasons, the king could govern in a way that the people couldn't, and therefore the people had to rely on the king to govern them, just like children have to rely on their parents to govern them. And the parents govern for the good of the child, and the notion was the king governs for the good of the subjects. And again, there were a range of arguments to make this case. Some were more practical and worldly, some had a kind of bit more of a religious flavor, some were more about tradition and things like that. We don't need to get into all of it. But basically the notion that the king would govern society as a father governing children, and this view is, no, that's not true. Nobody actually needs to rely on, say, the king to govern them because they're incapable of governing themselves the way that children are, okay? So this notion, all men are created equal, that's really what it means. And therefore they're endowed with certain, again, they're self-evident, clear to unassisted human reason. The only people who deny them are the people who benefit from the inequalities that exist in society. And again, the notion is these things are self-evident to unassisted human reason. There's no appeal to a particular political tradition. He's not saying as Englishmen or as British or as whatever we recognize this, nor is there obviously any reference to a religious tradition. He doesn't say you have to be Christian. He doesn't say you have to have a certain background or a certain set of beliefs. He says it's self-evident. All across the world, anybody can look and see people are naturally equal, and therefore government should reflect that fact, okay? So what are the rights to which people what are these inalienable natural rights that people have that are self-evident? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, okay? So obviously we all, as living beings, we have a basic right to life, okay? And then liberty, because the argument was, and this goes back to John Locke, the argument was, what good does it do you to say that you have a right to life if you can't protect your life through being free? If you're enslaved to another person, they can basically end your life whenever they want to. So to say you have a right to life really implies you have to have a right to liberty just in order to defend your life. And then Locke's view was, and therefore you have a right to property. We won't get into the reasons for that, but basically property is a little grubby as a reason to fight a revolution. So the pursuit of happiness, but this is also important because it gets in this idea, which again will be very important in American history and in American society, in the kind of self-conception that Americans usually have of themselves, some notion of freedom or autonomy, some notion of self-determination, some notion of, you get to decide for yourself what happiness is within reason, and then you pursue that, right? So life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the notion is that by nature we're all equal, which means, again, we're all free, right? If by nature, and if you think about, as they did at the time, one of the big ideas at the time was social contract theory, which is still underlies all of our, really all of our laws and institutions, this notion of social contract theory and the ideas embedded in it, or that kind of comprise it, still underlies our Constitution and all of that. Okay, so people don't necessarily talk about social contract theory the way that they may have at the time, but it's still of fundamental importance for our form of government and really in many ways for our society. So social contract theory, the notion was, imagine a state of nature, a time before society existed, before government existed. Everybody would be completely free. And again, because they would basically be equal, they would be free because nobody would have a real claim on anybody else in the state of nature. Nobody could go up to somebody and say, listen, I noticed you tried to eat a pear and instead you stuck it in your eye and blinded yourself. Why don't you let me govern you instead? Because it looks like you can't handle it. No, the notion was everybody is basically equal, therefore they're free. Nobody has a really legitimate or justified reason to claim to govern somebody else, to claim actual power over somebody else. So in this state of nature, people are free, they're equal, they have a basic right to life, and therefore they have a right to liberty in order to preserve their life, and then they have the right to whatever they get from laboring. Now that gets more complicated, because when you start talking about how you're acquiring things in the state of nature, you start to say, well, what if you're taking that from somebody else? Which again, we don't need to worry about right here. Because Jefferson changes it anyways, or the document changes it to the pursuit of happiness, okay? So the notion is these rights are fundamental, they are self-evident, that all people have these things, and therefore, again, government should reflect that. What does that mean? What should government look like if it's going to reflect these self-evident rights that people have? Okay, as he goes on to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So again, what does it mean for a government to be just? How can a government justify the powers that it's exercising when it governs? The consent of the governed. Since government exists to protect these rights, for government to be just, people have to consent. They have to agree. They have to see that the government is doing what it's supposed to. So again, if you go back to that social contract theory, the notion is in the state of nature, we're all perfectly free, and these rights are very, very important to us. What we fundamentally are, according to social contract theory, and again, this comes through in the Declaration of Independence, it comes through in the Constitution in a kind of much more indirect way, but it's still extremely important. So the notion is what we really are by nature, fundamentally, are free and equal individuals who have certain rights or certain natural rights, certain natural freedoms that we do not want to give up. You could debate this, right? Many people have challenged this view and say, well, we're really more social creatures and other things are more important to us than having these freedoms or these rights and never having to give them up. But this is the idea, right? Social contract theory, by nature, truly fundamentally what we really are free and equal individuals who have certain rights that we do not want to give up, that we do not want to be deprived of, okay? However, in the state of nature, we come to realize relatively quickly that the most fundamental rights that we have, things like the right to life or to liberty, or to some measure of security, we cannot provide very well for ourselves. Or in any case, we recognize if we came together and if we formed government, which as we talked about last time, collective action and a certain measure of authority, government saying, okay, here's the law, you're going to do this, you're not going to do that. If you break these laws, there are going to be real consequences. Okay, so it's collective action and the authority to actually carry these things out. That protects people's fundamental rights much better. Your right to life, your right to liberty. Certain less important rights, the freedom to do whatever you want to, whenever you want to, you give up some of those less important rights to have the most fundamental rights protected, okay? And that's the notion. That's why government exists. It exists, as it says here, to secure these rights. That's why governments are instituted among men, as they put it, okay? To protect these fundamental rights, and therefore the people can tell whether those rights are being protected or whether they're being threatened, infringed upon, whatever it is, right? So again, the notion is that people can see this, they can tell whether these rights are being protected or whether they're being threatened or even starting to be taken away. And therefore, as long as the government is doing what it's supposed to do, the people will consent. And that's when government is just, when it's justified, when it's legitimate, okay? So that's the notion, okay? This is what is the purpose of government? To secure these fundamental rights. Therefore, what makes government just or legitimate? The consent of the governed, the agreement of the people that the government is doing what it's supposed to do, where the people can understand perfectly well for themselves what the government is supposed to do, and whether or not it's actually doing that, okay? So he goes on and says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. Again, since you can see what the purpose of government is, and since the people can be the judge of that, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, to change it, to abolish it, and to institute new government, if need be, to actually rise up and create a new government by overthrowing the currently existing one that is, again, destructive of the ends of protecting people's rights, okay? So this, again, right to revolution, this comes directly from most of these ideas come directly from John Locke, who was an English philosopher who lived, a little bit before this time, a little bit before Jefferson, generation or two before him. And this right to revolution, he was the first one to really articulate it in this way. So again, the notion that that people can rise up and alter or abolish, just simply get rid of the government and create a new one that they think will best serve the purpose for which government exists, which is to protect their rights. That was, again, compare that to the notion of the king as the father and the head of the family. Obviously, that's the notion of revolution, much less to people of a right to revolution, totally foreign to that picture. So you can see what a break and what a dramatic change this was, okay, from what people had said before and believed before. Now, you might wonder, is there anything odd or incongruous or strange about this? Is there anything that as you're reading this, knowing some things about the history, and of course this is not primarily a history class, but still, knowing even a little bit about the history and things like that, you might think are odd. Is there anything that's like, well, I don't, Thomas Jefferson said that, really. So let's actually, let's go back real quick and go back to the Declaration of Independence here. I'm just going to jump. So in your course packet, okay, you will see that you also have the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, which Jefferson wrote by himself, submitted it to this committee. They made some changes. Franklin, John Adams were on the committee. I think there were one or two other people. Not really the crucial point here. Jefferson's draft, most of the changes were stylistic. Most of the things were for the sake of just improving, making it more readable, making it a little bit more, making the rhetoric and the language and the style and so on better. Here's really the most important substantive change was this part right here that he wrote. So, and this is when he lists, okay, we were just talking about what he says about the king and all these things. But then when he goes on and he says, we were talking about the basic ideas, and then he says, hey, the king has been, the British government, in particular the king, the head of the government, the executive who is acting as the head of the government, has acted in a way that has in fact been very destructive of these rights. Here's the evidence. And there's a long list of criticisms or complaints that we'll come back to in a second, because they are important, even though they can seem a little tiresome or a little, you may not quite see what the point is of reading all of them. We'll come back to that in a minute. But in this original draft, one of the criticisms he makes reads as follows. He says, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who have never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce. And then he goes on, he says, and now he's kind of, now that the colonies are thinking about rebelling, he's trying to incite the enslaved population to rise up against them. Okay, so what's going on here? Jefferson himself kind of famously owned slaves, and he writes this very fiery denunciation of slavery, which actually the other members of the committee, who were often Northerners, who themselves were opposed to slavery and certainly didn't own slaves themselves, said, listen, you have to take this out. The notion is all 13 colonies, including several slaveholding colonies, need to sign this document. Who are the representatives of these colonies going to be? The very wealthy people, right? The people who are being sent are not the poor or even the relatively modest middle class people, the delegates that are being sent here to make this decision are they're people, especially from these slaveholding states, they're people whose wealth comes from slaves, comes from slavery. They're not going to sign a document which seems to be saying that slavery is fundamentally, cruel war against human nature itself, can't possibly be defended, and therefore presumably will be gotten rid of if we win this war against the king, right? So they took it out because, again, they're like, listen, the other we need all 13 colonies. Benjamin Franklin's famous phrase, we must hang together, else we'll all hang separately, by which it means we need to stick together and cooperate and all act as one group, or we'll be hanged separately, meaning actually hanged as traitors, executed by hanging as individuals, as traitors, okay? So there's this very intense, fiery denunciation of slavery, which of course is important because people sometimes say, well, you got to put people in their context. You got to look at what people thought of, well, there's what people thought at the time, right? Before the United States even existed, before the final version of the Declaration of Independence was even submitted to be considered and signed by the delegates, Thomas Jefferson is saying it's cruel war against human nature itself. It's evil, it can't be defended, and so on. So people at the time were obviously well aware. Not all of them were necessarily agreed with Jefferson or necessarily were as troubled by what it meant. His famous phrase about slavery, I tremble for my country when I recall that God is just. Not all people and not all slave owners certainly were necessarily as troubled by all of that as Jefferson, but you see right there, clearly he knew that it was wrong. He was very emphatic that it was wrong. And you also see then a compromise. People sometimes, it's true that, as we've seen right here, a lot of these ideas in the Declaration of Independence, they're coming from a philosopher, John Locke. There's a lot of kind of theory, a lot of philosophy, which people are translating into practical terms, but you can overstate how much the American Revolution and the American government is the result of just taking these ideas and putting them into practice. The whole thing was very much restrained from the beginning by certain practical realities, okay? The first one, or one of the first ones, I don't know if you can really number them and say exactly which was first and second, but one of the first ones was slavery, right? Right here it is Jefferson saying, listen, the whole thing we're saying here is people by nature are free and equal. Obviously, a system of slavery is completely at odds with that, violates those principles, and in a really fundamental and terrible way. This isn't like, come to think of it, eventually you realize, this thing that we have, we could reform and make it better. It's like, no, this is just can't possibly affirm or allow this based on the principles that we've just laid out here. Okay, so that they were very aware of that. And then another thing which we'll see when we get into the actual design of the Constitution and with things like the Senate and other aspects of things is the existence of states, right? States were basically colonies. They were colonies which were created at different times by different monarchs for all kinds of different reasons, and they were obviously different sizes, different populations, also different physical sizes. And so when you get into the Constitution and deciding what is the right way to organize the government and what is the right way to do things like determine representation in Congress, well, you already have these states, and people already think of the states as important protections for individual rights, and also important vehicles for expressing interests and concerns and desires and so on. So the existence of the states is another important thing that was just sort of there, and they just kind of had to deal with. And they deal with it through things like the Senate. That's also federalism. The entire system of American government is this system of federalism where the national government shares power with the states. And why? Well, because the states were there and they weren't going anywhere. And the Anti-Federalists in particular were very concerned with preserving the states and making sure that the states continued to exist because they thought the states would really help protect individual rights. That may have been somewhat true in the 1780s. As you get later on after the Civil War, and especially into the 20th century, that's really not the case. For various reasons, the federal government does a much better job of protecting individual rights, whether you're talking about civil rights, but also civil liberties, also individual rights to, have representation at trial or free speech or all kinds of other things, which we'll talk about in a few weeks when we talk about civil liberties and the incorporation doctrine and things like that, okay? So basic ideas of the Declaration. Then there's that long list of criticisms. Again, you might feel like they're a little you know, meandering. You may not entirely understand, like, okay, and he did this and he stopped this from happening and he interfered with this. Some of the major themes, okay, basically he says that a lot of his criticisms center on the idea that the king is trying to prevent the legislative and the judicial power from carrying out their proper functions. He's trying to take power away from them so that they can't do what they're supposed to do. And what are they supposed to do? Well, one of the important, I mean, in part, you know, legislative power, the legislatures, the colonial legislatures were supposed to write laws and be a vehicle for self-determination and self-governance in the colonies. And of course, they're also supposed to be able to, well, to check the executive, but also basically the executive, the king, had too much power to stop these other branches from doing what they were supposed to do. So the colonial legislatures existed to allow the colonists to govern themselves, and the king, the executive, who was ultimately in charge, the king himself, would not just, you know, kind of strike down some of their laws, but try to prevent them from meeting, try to prevent them from having the power that they should. Same with the judicial branch, that should be able to tell, did somebody actually break the law? Is this actually, does this law violate something else? Again, taking away the power of the judicial branch. So what we saw and talked about some last time in terms of, in the first lecture, in terms of separation of power, checks and balances, all of these different specific acts, or not all of them, but many of them, the reason that the Declaration of Independence says that there's such a problem is that effectively what the king is trying to do is kind of pull out the foundation from under these other branches of government. And among other things, that will make it difficult for the actual system of checks and balances to exist and to work, which was not part of the colonial constitution, but it was an idea, again, that was already familiar from different European political thinkers. So there's a very clear notion of, hey, the king is trying to take all this power and concentrate it in his own person and in his own branch of government, basically. There were also some concern about the king trying to make the military power superior to the civil power. Again, this becomes a really important part of the Constitution, a very important idea that ultimately the military is under the control of civilian authority, which is ultimately democratically accountable. Okay, so that long list at the end, basically anticipating some, illustrating and giving voice to some really important concerns and some really important ideas about how government works or how it should work, and also then anticipating a lot of the things that you'll see put out and actually informing the creation of the Constitution itself. So there it is, you know, how do you have a government that can govern effectively, a government that is strong enough to govern effectively but will not abuse its power? And that's basically what the Federalist Papers are trying to figure out. 10 and 51 in particular, trying to figure out and trying to explain to people, here's how this government will be strong enough to govern effectively, to maintain order, to do the things that governments need to do, and yet will not abuse its power. And one of the crucial ideas is checks and balances, separation of powers, okay?